What's up, Wolverine fans? Jack here with another episode of the Big and Bold College Football Show. And on today's episode, of course, I am talking about the Rutgers at Michigan game. Check out my next video, I'm recording that later in the day, where I will be discussing their upcoming game with Wisconsin. It's my biggest preview yet for Michigan this season, considering this is their biggest game of the year. So please check that video out this week. It's a great preview. I have a lot of good information to put out there. Did a little bit of research, put some analysis into it, and I really hope you guys like the preview. But today, I gotta give you a quick overview of what happened in last week's game. Now, I said heading into the week that this was gonna be fairly brief because I felt like it's kind of a fourth week in a row of Michigan likely dominating an opponent. It's not really how it went though. This was a game of two halves. The first half was vastly different from the second half. Now, Michigan still walked away with a 20-13 victory. But obviously we have a few different points to make, and I've seen how Michigan fans feel about this current team and how this game went. So let's talk about some of those narratives and opinions. But to start, let's look at my three key points heading into the game. My first being, don't let Noah Vedral have the same kind of game he did last year, where he had 3 touchdowns, over 300 yards, where he nearly beat Michigan and really pushed them to the limit. Now, he did not have nearly as good a game as he did last year. He had 156 yards and a touchdown with 46 yards on the ground. He really performed well in the second half. That's where he had a rushing touchdown. That's where he had a passing touchdown to Aaron Young. That's where he got a lot of his rushing yards. It was all in the second half. But I'm going to talk about how that went a little bit more when I break down how the game really went. But overall, they did not let him dominate in this game, kind of like he did last year. My second point was allow Blake Corum to continue cooking up on defenses, maintain that Heisman hype, and dominate another opponent. That's really their best chance of beating anybody in the Big Ten, is Blake Corum having an elite game. Unfortunately, he was held to 21 carries for 68 yards. It's only 3.2 yards a carry. It was his worst game of the year. He really just wasn't able to get any running room. And I felt like the offense was trying too hard to run up the middle on Rutgers and not allowing him to get out in space and go out wide, which I thought was a little strange. The run game as a whole wasn't particularly good in this game, but unfortunately Blake Corum had a pretty rough performance out there, and that kind of killed his momentum a little bit on the season. And finally, my third point was don't overlook Rutgers. You know, we all know Michigan was gearing up for that Wisconsin game, but don't overlook a much different Rutgers team than what they have been in the past before Greg Schiano returned to the program. And they didn't. You know, I think they respected Rutgers, and they had a really good first half of football. They were up 20-3 after the first half. It's that second half of the game that fell apart for them, and I'll talk about that more later. But overall, they did not take Rutgers for granted, and they won the game. Second point to that was, sew up any issues your team has. Now, instead of sewing up any potential issues the team had heading into next week for the Wisconsin game, I felt like some issues were more so exposed by Rutgers, which isn't a bad thing. I think that people are overreacting a little bit to Michigan having some adversity in this game. And I think they're going to be able to watch film and identify, how do we improve our run game for next week? Well, now this week. How do we prevent Rutgers' run game from just pushing the ball on its down the field on 2 really good drives that they orchestrated? Now, as I said, this was a tale of 2 different games. This was the first half, and the second half was vastly different. In the first half, no complaints for the Wolverines. They were up 20-3, as I said. Cade McNamara had about 155 yards through the air. The run game wasn't fantastic. It was definitely the worst running performance we had seen up to that point. But Hassan Haskins did push the ball into the end zone twice. And Michigan was able to get a couple of field goals with Jake Moody. So really solid performance in the first half. The defense looked really good. They didn't give anything up to Rutgers in that first half outside of that 1 field goal. So you're really happy with how that went. Problem here is most certainly the second half, and that's where I'm going to spend a little bit more time. In the second half, Cade McNamara threw 7 yards. Yes, he went from throwing 155 in the first half to 7. And the really strange part of it is that in the first half, he was hitting open targets for the most part. It's not like they were, getting the ball downfield and orchestrating these complex plays, or it was a bunch of one-on-one tough catches for the receivers. He was hitting open guys mostly in the middle of the field. And that helped move them down the field because the run game wasn't doing it for them this time. But once they get in the red zone, Hassan Haskins pushed it in for 2 touchdowns. That second half, not like that at all. Cade was misplacing footballs. Guys weren't getting open quite as well. It was really a poor performance by the passing game. And it does make you nervous. And it certainly doesn't encourage any of the concerns people have had about Michigan's passing game up to this point. Considering Cade McNamara, his season stats through 4 games are what some guys are putting up in a single game thus far on the year. So it's a real concern with the passing game still. If you want to hear me get a little bit more into it, check out that Wisconsin preview I have coming up, where I really deep dive into what Michigan's passing game has been. But thus far, in this game against Rutgers, that first half performance, I was really impressed, even if he didn't put them in the end zone. Second half performance, passing game was abysmal. And the real concern there is that they had 3 straight 3-and-outs. Even when Rutgers was gaining a little bit of momentum, Michigan's offense, 3 straight 3-and-outs in the second half. That cannot happen against a team like Wisconsin. Talked about how Michigan's run game was not up to par, right, from what it's been in their first 3 games. You look at their run game, 38 carries for 112 yards and 2 touchdowns. That's only 2.9 yards a carry. Granted, when you exclude a few carries from Cade McNamara, which only came out to 1.7 a carry, Hassan Haskins and Blake Corum averaged about 3.3 yards a carry on the game, so very far away from the 300-yard games we were seeing from them in their first 3 weeks. Defensively, in the second half, the problem I noticed, and it's something that it looks like Greg Schiano in the second half was able to identify and that coaching staff worked out into their game plan, was Noah Vedral and the Rutgers running backs being able to hit Michigan with outside runs to the left or the right constantly in the second half. And Michigan didn't know how to really counter it. They got stuck trying to stop either Vedral or Pacheco at running back. And because of that, Rutgers' run game was actually really good. 42 carries for 196 yards. Michigan just happened to keep them out of the end zone. So you have to be a little concerned with Michigan's inability to stop the run in this game to the outside. And another big issue was missed tackles. Michigan's secondary, specifically their corners, have missed a lot of tackles, and especially in this game. They were not able to hold the edge when Rutgers tried to run to the outside. And Michigan's defensive line, outside linebackers, weren't able to hold the edge, in part because of the defensive scheme they were employing. I talked about before how Michigan has been utilizing this 2 down linemen, 2 edge rushers, and 2 inside linebackers. So they're presenting a really even front, if you picture that in your head, that offenses are looking at. And what Rutgers did was they saw that, and they said, okay, we're going to hit them left or we're going to hit them right. And they don't know which direction we're going to go. They don't know if it's going to be Vedral or one of our running backs. And they don't know who to stop. And no, they didn't have many great runs in the game. There was one 26-yard gain. That's really not what I'm worried about. But it was the fact that, no, they didn't give up big plays. In fact, their longest play of the game was, in fact, a single 26-yard carry. But it was the fact that they were able to constantly pick up between 4 and 6 yards on multiple drives in the second half and get down the field for a field goal, get down the field for a touchdown. Now, of course, what saved the day for Michigan was a forced fumble on Noah Vedral at the end of the fourth quarter, recovered by Michigan, and they were able to secure the win. They recovered the fumble, ran out a couple minutes on the clock, and that was game. Rutgers wasn't able to tie it up and force the game into overtime. Like you look at last year's game at Rutgers, where that went into overtime in a much higher scoring game. Reminds you a little bit of the Iowa game back in 2019 for the Wolverines. Where Iowa, down 3-10, has the football, trying to get down the field to tie it up. Michigan forces the fumble, recovers the ball to end the ball game. So nice job by Aiden Hutchinson. He had a solid game, had another sack in this performance. David Ajabo, I believe, is the one that forced that fumble on Noah Vedral. So ultimately, the defense saved the day for them. And considering Josh Ross went out with injury partway through the game, you could see that they really missed his presence on the defense. It was very different for them when he went down. Now, Junior Colson stepped in, the freshman, and actually looked very good for the Wolverines. But Josh Ross is their leading tackler with 29 tackles thus far on the season. And he was definitely missed and would have helped immensely in stopping that Rutgers run game if he didn't go down with injury. But that's kind of like what I was talking about with Michigan's depth, right? Single injury to any one position could really hurt them. Thus far, they've gotten by without Ronnie Bell, but the passing game is hurting. They most certainly could use him. I think Cornelius Johnson is a better number 2 wide receiver than number 1. Same with Josh Ross. Nikhai Hill-Green is a good linebacker. But that linebacking core is much, much better with Josh Ross on the field. Thankfully, he is probable to play against Wisconsin this week. Now, my kind of final points for this game, I think, is for everyone to kind of settle down a little bit. I understand that people are worried about the passing game. And the reason why is because they want Michigan to compete for a Big Ten title. They want Michigan to beat Ohio State, beat Penn State, Wisconsin, Michigan State. I understand that, but I don't like when people that were calling for Michigan to lose 5 or 6 games this year start heavily critiquing a team that's 4-0 and 14th right now in the AP poll, saying that they don't deserve to move up after beating Rutgers, and saying that, Cade McNamara is a bad quarterback. You thought they were going to lose 6 games. So what do you care right now? I think the real issue is that people are being proven wrong by this team because they keep winning, and people I don't think like that very much because they thought they were going to be a 5 or 6 win team. They looked at the media that was talking about Michigan coming into the year, and they believed it. They fed into it. They thought, yeah, I do think Michigan's going to suck this season. Well, thus far in the year, they're the 14th best team in the country. Now I understand. Like I said, stick with me here. Michigan passing game has struggled, and Michigan in this game against Rutgers did struggle. But if I told you coming into the year that they'd win 4 of their first 4 games, get bumped up to 14th in the country, steamroll 3 of those first 4 teams, and struggle a little bit in a close win, you'd be very happy with that if I told you that heading into this year. Now let's take a look around the country for a moment and take a peek into what some other teams are doing. If you're so concerned with what the Wolverines have done thus far. You've got 6th ranked Oklahoma, who struggled against Tulane, they struggled against Nebraska, and they struggled against West Virginia, having to go down the field to win with a last-second field goal. 11th ranked Ohio State lost to Oregon, giving up 500-yard games to Tulane, Minnesota, not to mention Oregon, of course. And just this past weekend, had a linebacker quit mid-game and slammed the team on social media. Now, I understand. Those 2 teams are ranked above Michigan. I'm not saying that Michigan's better than those 2 teams. But what I'm saying is things are getting really uncomfortable for those 2 programs. So Michigan's not the only one struggling. Let's take a look over to Michigan State, in-state rival. 17th ranked Michigan State had to go into overtime to beat Nebraska in the weekend in East Lansing. Iowa State came into the year as a top 10 team. They struggled against Northern Iowa, lost to in-state rival Iowa, and then lost on the road at Baylor. So they went from being a top 10 team to being a 2-loss team. Speaking of being a top 10 team and now being a 2-loss team, you can look to North Carolina, who just lost again. They lost and got upset by Virginia Tech to begin the season, and now is outside of the top 25 themselves. Clemson, the former number 2 team in the country coming into the year, is 2-2 and shouldn't even be ranked in the AP poll, but I believe they're coming in at 25. The trend with all of those teams, with the exception of Michigan State, all those teams are descending right now. Their fan bases are getting upset. They're falling down in the polls. They're losing football games. Michigan is ascending up the polls, winning football games. So there's a really big difference between what's happening with those programs and what's happening with Michigan. So what I'm trying to say is, who knows what's going to happen moving forward? But right now, you should probably just be happy that Michigan is 4-0, that they're 14th in the country, that they have an identity of being a run-first team with a fairly aggressive defense, and they're primed to take on Wisconsin and hopefully win in Madison, Wisconsin for the first time since 2001. So that's my overview from the weekend, guys. Thank you for listening. Believe me, Wolverine fans, I'm with you. I'm nervous about this team too. Because I called my shot. I said they're going to have a better year than people think. I think that them being a 9-win team should be expected, not become a ceiling for them. So I called my shot. What's probably happening, in my honest opinion, I think people are afraid to get hurt again. You know, this is a Michigan team the last 15, 20 years that's hurt their fans a lot. And I think people are just apprehensive about the future. They don't believe Michigan will be successful moving forward because of their passing game. And that could be true. But Wisconsin, there's another team right there. They're 1-2 right now. Michigan State, they look very human. They haven't done anything better than Michigan has thus far on the season. Ohio State, incredibly vulnerable defensively, and now there's a quarterback controversy. The only team on Michigan's schedule who legitimately looks like a potentially unstoppable threat is Penn State. And in the past, that hasn't been the case. Penn State, they tend to drop a game or two during the regular season. Whether it's to Ohio State, you could look to 2016 when it was Michigan. It's happened. But with that, thank you for listening, guys. Please check out my Wisconsin preview. I've put a lot of effort into this one. Let me know what you guys think in the comments about this Michigan team. What's your favorite thing about them thus far? Is it the run game? Is it the defense? Are you a Blake Corum fan or an Aiden Hutchinson fan? And enjoy the rest of your week, everybody.